The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 1. By a happy coincidence, the false decretals appeared shortly before the election of one of the most commanding figures in papal history. Nicholas I, 858 to 867, had received an exceptionally thorough education in the law and traditions of the Church, and had been apprenticed to his high office by being a favored aide of several popes. He equaled the great Gregories, the first and the seventh, in strength of will, and surpassed them in the extent and success of his claims. Starting from premises then accepted by all Christians, that the Son of God had founded the Church by making Peter her first head, and that the bishops of Rome inherited their power from Peter in direct line, Nicholas reasonably concluded that the Pope, as God's representative on earth, should enjoy a suzerain authority over all Christians, rulers as well as subjects, at least in matters of faith and morals. Nicholas eloquently expounded this simple argument, and no one in Latin Christendom dared contradict it. Kings and archbishops could only hope that he would not take it too seriously. They were disappointed. When Lothair II, King of Lorraine, wished to divorce his queen Teutberga and marry his mistress, Waldrida, the chief prelates of his kingdom granted his wish in 862. Teutberga appealed to Nicholas, who sent legates to Metz to examine the matter. Lothair bribed the legates to confirm the divorce. The archbishops of Trier and Cologne brought this decision to the Pope. Nicholas discovered the fraud, excommunicated the archbishops, and ordered Lothair to dismiss his mistress and take back his wife. Lothair refused and marched with an army against Rome. Nicholas remained for 48 hours in St. Peter's in fasting and prayer. Lothair lost courage and submitted to the Pope's commands. Hincmar, Archbishop of Reims, and the greatest prelate in Latin Europe after the Pope himself, dismissed a bishop, Ratherud, who appealed to Nicholas in 863. Having reviewed the case, Nicholas ordered Ratherud reinstated. When Hincmar hesitated, the Pope threatened to lay an interdict, a suspension of all church services, upon his province. Hincmar fumed and yielded. To kings as well as prelates, Nicholas wrote as one having supreme authority, and only Photius of Constantinople dared gainsay him. In nearly every case, later developments showed the Pope to have been on the side of justice, and his stern defense of morality was a lamp and tower in a decadent age. When he died, the power of the papacy was acknowledged more widely than ever before. 4. The Greek Church, 566 to 898. The patriarchs of the Eastern Church could not admit the overriding jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome for a simple reason. They had long since been subordinated to the Greek emperors, and these would not till 871 abandon their claim to sovereignty over Rome and its popes. The patriarchs occasionally criticized, disobeyed, even denounced the emperors, but they were appointed and deposed by the emperors, who called ecclesiastical councils, regulated church affairs by state law, and published their theological opinions and directives to the ecclesiastical world. The only checks on the religious autocracy of the emperor in Eastern Christendom were the power of the monks, the tongue of the patriarch, and the vow taken by the emperor at his coronation by the patriarch that he would introduce no novelty into the church. Constantinople, indeed all the Greek East, was now dotted with monasteries and nunneries in far greater number than in the West. The monastic passion captured some of the Byzantine emperors themselves. They lived like ascetics amid the luxury of the palace, heard Mass daily, ate abstemiously, and bemoaned their sins as sedulously as they committed them. The piety of emperors and of the moribund rich enlarged and multiplied the monasteries with gifts and legacies. Men and women of high rank, frightened by omens of death, sought admission to monasteries and brought with them an ingratiating wealth that would no longer be subject to taxation. Others deeded some of their property to a monastery, which then paid them an annuity. Many monasteries claimed to possess relics of revered saints. People credited the monks with control of the wonder-working power of these relics, and offered their coins in the hope of making an unreasonable profit on their investments. A minority of the monks disgraced their faith with idleness, venery, faction, and greed. The majority were reconciled to virtue and peace. Altogether, the monks enjoyed a popular veneration, a material wealth, and even a political influence that no emperor could ignore. Theodore, from 759 to 826, abbot of the monastery of Studian in Constantinople, was an exemplar of monastic piety and power. Dedicated to the Church by his mother in his childhood, he accepted the Christian mood so thoroughly that in his mother's last illness he complimented her on her approaching death and glory. He drew up for his monks a code of labor, prayer, chastity, and intellectual development that could stand comparison with that of Benedict in the West. He defended the use of religious images and boldly denied, before the Emperor Leo V, that the secular power had any jurisdiction over ecclesiastical affairs. 4 times he was banished for this intransigence, but from his exile he continued to resist the iconoclasts till his death. Differences of language, liturgy, and doctrine during these centuries drove Latin and Greek Christianity further and further apart, like a biological species divided in space and diversified in time. Greek liturgy, ecclesiastical vestments, vessels, and ornaments were more complex, ornate, and artistically wrought than those of the West. The Greek cross had equal arms, the Greeks prayed standing, the Latins kneeling. The Greeks baptized by immersion, the Latins by aspersion. Marriage was forbidden to Latin, permitted to Greek priests. Latin priests shaved, Greek priests had contemplative beards. The Latin clergy specialized in politics, the Greek in theology. Heresy almost always rose in an East that had inherited the Greek passion for defining the infinite. From the old Gnostic heresies of Bardesanes in Syria, and perhaps from the westward movement of Manichaean ideas, there arose in Armenia, about 660, a sect of Paulicians that took its name from St. Paul, rejected the Old Testament, the sacraments, the reverence paid to images, the symbolism of the cross. Like some advancing pullulation, these groups and theories spread through the Near East into the Balkans, Italy, and France. They bore heroically the most merciless persecutions, and still survive as remnants in the Molokani, the Clistai, and the Doukhobors. The Monothelite controversy was more agitated by the emperors than by the people, and doubtless the people were not responsible for the filioque that so tragically advanced the schism of Greek from Latin Christianity. The Nicene Creed had spoken of the Holy Ghost who proceedeth from the Father, ex patre procedit. For 250 years this sufficed. But in 589 a church council at Toledo made the statement read, ex patre filioque procedit, proceedeth from the Father and the Son. This addition was accepted in Gaul and zealously adopted by Charlemagne. The Greek theologians protested that the Holy Ghost proceeded not from, but through the Son. The popes held the balance patiently for a time, and not until the 11th century was the filioque officially entered into the Latin Creed. Meanwhile, a struggle of wills was added to the conflict of ideas. Among the monks who had fled from iconoclastic oppression was Ignatius, son of the Emperor Michael I. In 840, the Empress Theodora recalled the monk and made him patriarch. He was a man of piety and courage. He denounced the prime minister, Caesar Bardus, who had divorced his wife and lived with the widow of his son. And when Bardus persisted in incest, Ignatius excluded him from the church. Bardus banished Ignatius and raised to the patriarchate the most accomplished scholar of the age in 858. Photius, possibly from 820 to 891, was a master of philology, oratory, science, and philosophy. His lectures at the University of Constantinople had drawn to him a group of devoted students, to whom he opened his library and his home. Shortly before his promotion to the patriarchal see, he had completed an encyclopedic Myriabiblion in 280 chapters, each of which reviewed and sampled an important book. Through this vast compilation, many passages of classic literature were preserved. His broad culture raised Photius above the fanaticism of the populace, which could not understand why he remained on such good terms with the Emir of Crete. His sudden elevation from layman to patriarch offended the clergy of Constantinople. Ignatius refused to resign and appealed to the Bishop of Rome. Nicholas I sent legates to Constantinople to inquire into the case, and in letters to the Emperor Michael III and Photius, he laid down the principle that no ecclesiastical matter of grave moment should be decided anywhere in Christendom without the consent of the Pope. The Emperor called a church council, which ratified the appointment of Photius, and the Pope's legates joined in the confirmation. When they returned to Rome, Nicholas repudiated them as having exceeded their instructions. He ordered the Emperor to reinstate Ignatius, and when his command was ignored, he excommunicated Photius in 863. Bardus threatened to send an army to depose Nicholas. The Pope, in an eloquent reply, scornfully pointed to the Emperor's submission to the marauding Slavs and Saracens. "We have not invaded Crete. We have not depopulated Sicily. We have not subdued Greece. We have not burned the churches in the very suburbs of Constantinople. Yet while these pagans with impunity conquer, burn, and lay waste your territories, we, Catholic Christians, are menaced with the vain terror of your arms. Ye release Barabbas and kill Christ." Photius and the Emperor called another church council which excommunicated the Pope in 867 and denounced the heresies of the Roman Church, among them the procession of the Holy Ghost from the Father and the Son, the shaving of priestly beards, and the enforced celibacy of the clergy. From this usage, said Photius, we see in the West so many children who do not know their fathers. While Greek messengers were bearing these pleasantries to Rome, the situation was suddenly changed in 867 by the accession of Basil I, who had murdered Caesar Bardus and had superintended the assassination of Michael III. Photius denounced the new emperor as a murderer and refused him the sacraments. Basil called a church council, which obediently deposed, insulted, and banished Photius, and restored Ignatius. But when Ignatius soon thereafter died, Basil recalled Photius. A council reinstated him as patriarch, and, Nicholas I having died, Pope John VIII approved. The schism of East and West was for a moment postponed by the death of the protagonists. 5. The Christian conquest of Europe, 529 to 1054. The most momentous event in the religious history of these centuries was not the quarrel of the Greek with the Latin Church, but the rise of Islam as a challenge to Christianity in both East and West. The religion of Christ had hardly consolidated its victories over the pagan empire and the heresies, when suddenly its most fervid provinces were torn from it, and with alarming ease, by a faith that scorned both the theology and the ethics of Christianity. Patriarchs still sat by Moslem tolerance in the sees of Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. But the Christian glory was departed from those regions, and what Christianity remained in them was heretical and nationalist. Armenia, Syria, and Egypt had set up church hierarchies quite independent of either Constantinople or Rome. Greece was saved to Christianity. There the monks triumphed over the philosophers, and the great monastery of the Holy Lavra, established on Mount Athos in 961, rivaled the majesty of the Parthenon, which had become a Christian church. Africa still had many Christians in the 9th century, but they were rapidly diminishing under the handicaps of Moslem rule. In 711, most of Spain was lost to Islam. Defeated in Asia and Africa, Christianity turned north and resumed the conquest of Europe. Italy, bravely but narrowly saved from the Saracens, was divided between the Greek and Latin forms of Christianity. Almost on the dividing line was Monte Cassino. Under the long rule, from 1058 to 1087, of Abbot Desiderius, the monastery reached the zenith of its fame. From Constantinople he brought not only 2 magnificent bronze doors, but craftsmen who adorned the interiors with mosaics, enamels, and artistry in metal, ivory, and wood. The monastery became almost a university, with courses in grammar, classical as well as Christian literature, theology, medicine, and law. Following Byzantine models, the monks executed exceptionally fine illuminated manuscripts and copied in a beautiful book hand the classics of pagan Rome. Some classics were only thus preserved. In Rome, the Church, under Pope Boniface IV and his successors, instead of permitting the further disintegration of pagan temples, reconsecrated them to Christian use and care. The Pantheon was dedicated to the Virgin Mary and all martyrs in 609. The Temple of Janus became the Church of St. Dionysius. The Temple of Saturn became the Church of the Savior. Leo IV, from 847 to 855, renewed and embellished St. Peter's, and through the growth of the papacy and the coming of pilgrims, a polyglot suburb grew around that group of ecclesiastical buildings which took its name from the ancient Vatican Hill. France was now the richest possession of the Latin Church. The Merovingian kings, confident of buying heaven after enjoying polygamy and murder, showered the bishoprics with lands and revenues. Here, as elsewhere, the Church received legacies from penitent magnates and devout heiresses. Chilperic's prohibition of such bequests was soon cancelled by Guthrum. By one of the many pleasantries of history, the Gallic clergy were almost wholly recruited from the Gallo-Roman population. The converted Franks knelt at the feet of those whom they had conquered, and gave back in pious donations what they had stolen in war. The clergy were the ablest, best educated, and least immoral element in Gaul. They almost monopolized literacy, and though a small minority led scandalous lives, most of them labored faithfully to give schooling and morals to a population suffering from the greed and wars of their lords and kings, secular as well as religious authorities in their dioceses, and their tribunals were the favorite resort of litigants even in non-ecclesiastical concerns. Everywhere they took under their protection orphans and widows, paupers and slaves. In many dioceses the Church provided hospitals. One such, Hôtel Dieu, Inn of God, was opened in Paris in 651. Saint-Germain, Bishop of Paris in the second half of the 6th century, was known throughout Europe for his work in raising funds, and spending his own, to emancipate slaves. Bishop Sidonius of Mainz banked the Rhine. Bishop Felix of Nantes straightened the course of the Loire. Bishop Didier of Cahors constructed aqueducts. Saint Agobard 779 to 840, Archbishop of Lyons, was a model of religion and a foe of superstition. He condemned trial by duel or ordeal, the worship of images, the magical explanation of storms, and the fallacies involved in the prosecutions for witchcraft. He was the clearest head of his time. Hincmar, the aristocratic primate of Reims, 845 to 882, presided over a score of church councils, wrote 66 books, served as prime minister to Charles the Bald, and almost established a theocracy in France. In each country, Christianity took on the qualities of the national temperament. In Ireland it became mystic, sentimental, individualistic, passionate. It adopted the fairies, the poetry, the wild and tender imagination of the Celt. The priests inherited the magic powers of the Druids and the myths of the bards. And the tribal organization favored a centrifugal looseness in the structure of the church. Almost every locality had an independent bishop. More numerous and influential than the bishops and priests were the monks who, in groups seldom numbering more than 12, formed half-isolated and mostly autonomous monasteries throughout the island, recognizing the Pope as head of the church but submitting to no external control. The earlier monks lived in separate cells, practicing a somber asceticism and meeting only for prayer. A later generation, the Second Order of Irish Saints, diverged from this Egyptian tradition, studied together, learned Greek, copied manuscripts, and established schools for clerics and laity. From the Irish schools in the 6th and 7th centuries, a succession of renowned and redoubtable saints passed over into Scotland, England, Gaul, Germany, and Italy to revitalize and educate a darkened Christianity. Almost all Ireland, wrote a Frank about 850, comes flocking to our shores with a troop of philosophers. As Germanic invasions of Gaul and Britain had driven scholars from those lands to Ireland, so now the wave returned, the debt was paid. Irish missionaries flung themselves upon the victorious pagan Angles, Saxons, Norwegians, and Danes in England, and upon the illiterate and half-barbarous Christians of Gaul and Germany, with the Bible in one hand and classic manuscripts in the other. And for a time it seemed that the Celts would win back through Christianity the lands they had lost to force. It was in the Dark Ages that the Irish spirit shone with its strongest light. The greatest of these missionaries was St. Columba. We know him well through the biography written, circa 679, by Adamnan, one of his successors at Iona. Columba was born at Donegal in 521, of royal stock. Like Buddha, he was a saint who could have been a king. At school in Moville he showed such devotion that his schoolmaster named him Columkill, column of the church. From the age of 25 he founded a number of churches and monasteries, of which the most famous were at Derry, Durrow, and Kells. But he was a fighter as well as a saint, a man of powerful frame and mighty voice. His hot temper drew him into many quarrels, at last into war with King Dermid. A battle was fought in which, we are told, 5,000 men were killed. Columba, though victorious, fled from Ireland in 563, resolved to convert as many souls as had fallen in that engagement at Culdrevna. He now founded on the island of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland, one of the most illustrious of medieval monasteries. Thence he and his disciples brought the gospel to the Hebrides, Scotland, and northern England. And there, after converting thousands of pagans and illuminating 300 noble books, he died in prayer at the altar in his 78th year. Kindred to him in spirit and name was St. Columban. Born in Leinster about 543, he does not enter history till we find him, aged 32, establishing monasteries in the wilds of the Vosges mountains of France. At Luxeuil he instructed his novices, "You must fast every day, pray every day, work every day, read every day. A monk must live under the rule of one father, and in the society of many brethren, that he may learn humility from one, patience from another, silence from a third, gentleness from a fourth. He must go to bed so tired that he will fall asleep on the way." Punishments were severe, usually by flogging. 6 stripes for coughing when beginning a psalm, or neglecting to manicure the nails before saying Mass, or smiling during services, or striking the teeth on the chalice at communion. 12 for omitting grace at meal, 50 for being late at prayers, 100 for engaging in a dispute, 200 for speaking familiarly with a woman. Despite this reign of terror, there was no lack of novices. Luxeuil had 60 monks, many from rich families. They lived on bread, vegetables, and water, cleared forests, plowed fields, planted and reaped, fasted and prayed. Here Columban established the Laus Perennis, or unending praise. All day and night, through relays of monks, litanies were to rise to Jesus, Mary, and the saints. 1,000 monasteries like Luxeuil are a pervasive element in the medieval scene. The stern temper that framed this rule allowed no compromise with other views, and Columban, who banned disputes, found himself in repeated quarrels with the bishops, whose authority he ignored, with secular officials, whose interferences he repelled, and even with the popes. For the Irish celebrated Easter according to a reckoning practiced by the early Church, but abandoned by her in 343. In a consequent conflict with the Gallic clergy, these appealed to Gregory the Great. Columban rejected the Pope's instructions, saying, "The Irish are better astronomers than you Romans," and bade Gregory accept the Irish mode of calculation, or be looked upon as a heretic and repudiated with scorn by the churches of the West. The rebellious Irishman was expelled from Gaul in 609 for denouncing the wickedness of Queen Brunhild. He was put by force on a vessel bound for Ireland. The ship was driven back to France. Columban crossed the forbidden land and preached to the pagans of Bavaria. He could hardly have been as terrible a man as his rule and career picture him, for we are told that squirrels perched confidently on his shoulders and ran in and out of his cowl. Leaving a fellow Irishman to found in 613 the monastery of St. Gall on Lake Constance, he painfully crossed the St. Gothard Pass and established the monastery of Bobbio in Lombardy in 613. There, 2 years later, in the austerity of his solitary cell, he died. Tertullian mentions Christians in Britain in 208. Bede speaks of St. Alban as dying in the persecution by Diocletian. British bishops attended the Council of Sardica in 347. Germanus, Bishop of Auxerre, went to Britain in 429 to suppress the Pelagian heresy. William of Malmesbury avers that the bishop, presumably on a later visit, routed an army of Saxons by having his British converts shout hallelujah at them. From this vigorous condition, British Christianity pined and almost died in the Anglo-Saxon invasions. We hear nothing of it again until, at the end of the 6th century, the disciples of Columba entered Northumberland, and Augustine, with 7 other monks, reached England from Rome. Doubtless Pope Gregory had learned that Ethelbert, the pagan king of Kent, had married Bertha, a Christian Merovingian princess. Ethelbert listened courteously to Augustine, remained unconvinced, but gave him freedom to preach, and provided food and lodging for him and his fellow monks in Canterbury. At last, in 599, the queen prevailed upon the king to accept the new faith, and many subjects followed their example. In 601, Gregory sent the pallium to Augustine, who became the first in an impressive line of distinguished archbishops of Canterbury. Gregory was lenient to the lingering paganism of England. He allowed the old temples to be christened into churches, and permitted the custom of sacrificing oxen to the gods to be gently transformed into killing them to the refreshing of themselves to the praise of God, so that the English merely changed from eating beef when they praised God to praising God when they ate beef. Another Italian missionary, Paulinus, carried Christianity to Northumberland in 627. Oswald, king of Northumberland, invited the monks of Iona to come and preach to his people, and to help their work he gave them the island of Lindisfarne off the east coast. There St. Aidan, in 634, founded a monastery that glorified its name by missionary devotion and the splendor of its illuminated manuscripts. There and at Melrose Abbey, St. Cuthbert, possibly from 635 to 687, left behind him loving memories of his patience, piety, good humor, and good sense. The holiness of such men, and perhaps the peace and security they enjoyed amid recurrent wars, brought many neophytes to the monasteries and nunneries that now arose in England. Despite occasional lapses into the ways of common men, the monks gave dignity to work by their labor in woods and fields. Here, too, as in France and Germany, they led the advance of civilization against marsh and jungle, as well as against illiteracy, violence, lechery, drunkenness, and greed. Bede thought that too many Englishmen were entering monasteries, that too many monasteries were being founded by nobles to put their property beyond taxation, and that the tax-exempt lands of the Church were absorbing too much of England's soil. Too few soldiers were left, he warned, to preserve England from invasion. Soon the Danes, then the Normans, would prove the worldly wisdom of the monk. Strife found its way even into monastic peace, when the Benedictine monks of southern England, following the Roman ritual and the calendar, came into contact and conflict with the Irish monks in calendar and liturgy in the north. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, St. Wilfrid's eloquence decided the issue, technically the proper date for Easter, in favor of Rome. The Irish missionaries pugnaciously resigned themselves to the decision. The British Church, unified and endowed, became an economic and political power and took a leading role in civilizing the people and governing the state. Christianity came to Germany as the gift of Irish and English monks. In 690, the Northumbrian monk Willibrord, who had been educated in Ireland, crossed the North Sea with 12 adventurous aides, fixed his episcopal seat at Utrecht, and labored for 40 years to convert the Frisians. But these realistic lowlanders saw in Willibrord the hand of his protector Pepin the Young, and feared that their conversion would subject them to the Franks. Moreover, they were not pleased to be told that all their unbaptized forebears were in hell. A Frisian king, having learned this as he stood on the brink of baptism, turned away, saying that he preferred to spend eternity with his ancestors. A stronger man than Willibrord renewed the campaign in 716. Winfrid, from possibly 680 to 754, an English noble and Benedictine monk, won the name of Boniface from Pope Gregory II and the title of Apostle of Germany from a pious posterity. Near Fritzlar in Hesse he found an oak tree worshipped by the people as the home of a god. He felled it, and the populace, amazed at his survival, flocked to be baptized. Great monasteries were set up at Reichenau in 724, Fulda in 744, and Lorsch in 763. In 748, Boniface was made Archbishop of Mainz. He appointed bishops and organized the German Church into a powerful engine of moral, economic, and political order. Having accomplished his mission in Hesse and Thuringia, and seeking to crown his career with a martyr's death, Boniface gave up his proud episcopate and entered Frisia, resolved to complete the work of Willibrord. He had labored there a year when he was attacked by the pagans and slain. A generation later, Charlemagne brought Christianity to the Saxons with fire and sword. The obstinate Frisians thought it time to yield, and the conquest of Rome's conquerors by Roman Christianity was complete. The final triumph of the faith in Europe was the conversion of the Slavs. In 861, Prince Rostislav of Moravia, noting the entrance into his realm of a Latin Christianity that ignored the vernacular in its liturgy, applied to Byzantium for missionaries who would preach and pray in the vulgar tongue. The emperor sent him 2 brothers, Methodius and Cyril, who, having been reared in Salonika, spoke Slavonic with ease. They were welcomed, but found that the Slavs had as yet no alphabet to fully express their language in writing. The few Slavs who wrote used Greek and Latin characters to represent their speech. Cyril thereupon invented the Slavonic alphabet and script by adopting the Greek alphabet with the values that Greek usage had given it by the 9th century. B sounded as V, H as I, or the English E, CHI as the Scotch CH. And he devised original letters for Slavonic sounds not expressible by Greek characters. With this alphabet, Cyril translated into Slavonic the Septuagint Greek version of the Old Testament and the Greek liturgical texts, thereby inaugurating a new written language and a new literature. A struggle now ensued between Greek and Latin Christianity to see which should capture the Slavs. Pope Nicholas I invited Cyril and Methodius to Rome, where Cyril took monastic vows, fell ill, and died in 869. Methodius returned to Moravia as an archbishop consecrated by the Pope. Pope John VIII allowed the use of the Slavonic liturgy. Stephen V forbade it. Moravia, Bohemia, and Slovakia, these constituting the Czechoslovakia of today, and later Hungary and Poland, were won to the Latin Church and Rite, while Bulgaria, Serbia, and Russia accepted the Slavonic liturgy and alphabet, gave their allegiance to the Greek Church, and took their culture from Byzantium. Political calculations influenced these religious transformations. The conversions of the Germans aimed to incorporate them firmly into the realm of the Franks. King Harold Bluetooth imposed Christianity upon Denmark in 974 as part of the price that the Emperor Otto II demanded for peace. Boris of Bulgaria, after flirting with the papacy, went over to the Greek Church in 864 to win protection against an expanding Germany. And Vladimir I made Russia Christian in 988 to win the hand of Anna, sister of the Greek Emperor Basil II, and to obtain part of the Crimea as her dowry. For 2 centuries the Russian Church acknowledged the Patriarch of Constantinople. In the 13th century it declared its independence. And after the fall of the Eastern Empire in 1453, the Russian Church became the dominant factor in the Greek Orthodox world. The victorious soldiers in this Christian conquest of Europe were the monks, and the nurses in this war were the nuns. The monks helped the peasant pioneers to bring the wilderness under cultivation, to clear the forest and the brush, to drain the swamps and bridge the creeks and cut the roads. They organized industrial centers, schools, and charity, copied manuscripts and collected modest libraries, gave moral order, courage, and comfort to bewildered men uprooted from their traditional customs, cults, or homes. Benedict of Anian labored, dug, and reaped amid his monks, and the monk Theodulf near Reims drove the plough so faithfully for 22 years that after his death it was kept as an object of veneration. Periodically, after superhuman exaltations of virtue, devotion, and energy, monks and nuns relapsed into human nature, and in almost every century a campaign of monastic reform was needed to lift the monks again to the unnatural heights of their rule. Some monks enlisted in passing moods of piety and self-surrender, and were maladapted to the discipline after their ecstasy waned. Some were oblates, who had been brought to the monasteries and vowed to the monastic life by their parents when they were children of 7 or more years of age, sometimes when they were infants in the cradle, and these vicarious vows were held irrevocable until, in 1179, papal decrees allowed their annulment at the age of 14. In 817, Louis the Pious, shocked by the lax discipline of French monasteries, called a national assembly of abbots and monks at Aachen, and commissioned Benedict of Aniane to re-establish the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia in all the monasteries of the realm. The new Benedict labored sedulously, but he died in 821. The wars of the kings soon disordered the Frank Empire, and Norman, Magyar, and Saracen raids despoiled hundreds of monasteries. Monks wandered homeless into the secular world, and those who returned after the wave of devastation had receded brought with them worldly ways. Feudal lords seized monasteries, appointed their abbots, appropriated their revenues. By 900 the monasteries of the West, like almost every institution in Latin Europe, had sunk to the lowest point in their medieval history. Some clergy, secular and regular, said St. Odo of Cluny, who died in 942, do so set to naught the Virgin Son that they commit fornication in his very courts, nay, in those very inns which the devotion of the faithful hath built, in order that chastity may be kept safely within their fenced precincts. They so overflow with lust that Mary hath no room wherein to lay the child Jesus. It was from Cluny that the great reform of the monasteries came. About 910, 12 monks had established a monastery there in the hills of Burgundy, almost on the German-French frontier. In 927, Abbot Odo revised its rule towards a moral rigor combined with physical lenience. Asceticism was rejected, baths were recommended, diet was generous, beer and wine were allowed. But the old vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity were to be unremittingly enforced. Similar institutions were opened elsewhere in France, but whereas each monastery had heretofore been a lawless law unto itself, or had been loosely subject to local bishop or lord, the new Benedictine monasteries allied with Cluny were ruled by priors subject both to the abbots of Cluny and to the popes. Under Cluny's abbots, Meul, from 954 to 994, Odilo, from 994 to 1049, and Hugh, from 1049 to 1109, the movement for monastic affiliation spread from France to England, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Italy, and Spain. Many old monasteries joined the Cluniac congregation. By 1100, some 2,000 priories acknowledged Cluny as their mother and ruler. The power so organized, free from state interference and episcopal supervision, gave the papacy a new weapon with which to control the secular hierarchy of the Church. At the same time, it made possible a courageous reform of monasticism by the monks themselves. Disorder, idleness, luxury, immorality, simony were brought under firm rule, and Italy beheld the strange sight of a French monk, Odo, invited to Italy to reform Monte Cassino itself. 6. The nadir of the papacy, 867 to 1049. Reform reached Rome last of all. The populace of the city had always been unmanageable, even when the imperial eagle had wielded legions in its claws. Now the pontiffs, armed only with a weak militia, the majesty of their office and the terror of their creed, found themselves the prisoners of a jealous aristocracy and of a citizenry whose piety suffered from nearness to Peter's throne. The Romans were too proud to be impressed by kings and too familiar to be awed by popes. They saw in the vicars of Christ men subject like themselves to sickness, error, sin, and defeat. And they came to view the papacy not as a fortress of order and a tower of salvation, but as a collection agency whereby the pence of Europe might provide the dole of Rome. By the tradition of the Church, no pope could be elected without the consent of the Roman clergy, nobles, and populace. The rulers of Spoleto, Benevento, Naples, and Tuscany, and the aristocracy of Rome divided into factions as of old, and whichever faction prevailed in the city intrigued to choose and sway the pope. Between them, they dragged the papacy in the 10th century to the lowest level in its history. In 878, Duke Lambert of Spoleto entered Rome with his army, seized Pope John VIII, and tried to starve him into favoring Carloman for the imperial throne. In 897, Pope Stephen VI had the corpse of Pope Formosus, 891 to 896, exhumed, dressed in purple robes, and tried before an ecclesiastical council on the charge of violating certain church laws. The corpse was condemned, stripped, mutilated, and plunged into the Tiber. In the same year, a political revolution in Rome overthrew Stephen, who was strangled in jail. For several years thereafter, the papal chair was filled by bribery, murder, or the favor of women of high rank and low morality. For half a century, the family of Theophylact, a chief official of the papal palace, made and unmade popes at will. His daughter, Marozia, secured the election of her lover as Pope Sergius III from 904 to 911. His wife, Theodora, procured the election of Pope John X from 914 to 928. John has been accused of being Theodora's paramour, but on inadequate evidence. Certainly he was an excellent secular leader, for it was he who organized the coalition that in 916 repulsed the Saracens from Rome. Marozia, after having enjoyed a succession of lovers, married Guido, Duke of Tuscany. They conspired to unseat John. They had his brother Peter killed before his face. The Pope was thrown into prison and died there a few months later from causes unknown. In 931, Marozia raised to the papacy John XI, from 931 to 935, commonly reputed to be her bastard son by Sergius III. In 932, her son Alberic imprisoned John in the castle of St. Angelo, but allowed him to exercise from jail the spiritual functions of the papacy. For 22 years, Alberic ruled Rome as the dictatorial head of a Roman republic. At his death, he bequeathed his power to his son Octavian, and made the clergy and people promise to choose Octavian pope when Agapetus II should die. It was done as he ordered. In 955, Marozia's grandson became John XII, and distinguished his pontificate by orgies of debauchery in the Lateran palace. Otto I of Germany, crowned emperor by John XII in 962, learned the degradation of the papacy at first hand. In 963, with the support of the Transalpine clergy, Otto returned to Rome and summoned John to trial before an ecclesiastical council. Cardinals charged that John had taken bribes for consecrating bishops, had made a boy of 10 a bishop, had committed adultery with his father's concubine and incest with his father's widow and her niece, and had made the papal palace a very brothel. John refused to attend the council or to answer the charges. Instead, he went out hunting. The council deposed him and unanimously chose Otto's candidate, a layman, as Pope Leo VIII, from 963 to 965. After Otto had returned to Germany, John seized and mutilated the leaders of the imperial party in Rome and had himself restored by an obedient council to the papacy in 964. When John died in 964, the Romans elected Benedict V, ignoring Leo. Otto came down from Germany, deposed Benedict, and restored Leo, who thereupon officially recognized the right of Otto and his imperial successors to veto the election of any future pope. The Roman Catholic Church regards Leo VIII as anti-pope and attributes no validity to his actions or decrees. On Leo's death, Otto secured the election of John XIII from 965 to 972. Benedict VI, from 973 to 974, was imprisoned and strangled by a Roman noble, Bonifacio Francone, who made himself pope for a month, then fled to Constantinople with as much papal treasury as he could carry. 9 years later he returned, killed Pope John XIV, from 983 to 984, again appropriated the papal office, and died peaceably in bed in 985. The Roman Republic again raised its head, assumed authority, and chose Crescentius as consul. Otto III descended upon Rome with an irresistible army and a commission from the German prelates to end the chaos by making his chaplain Pope Gregory V, from 996 to 999. The young emperor put down the Republic, pardoned Crescentius, and went back to Germany. Crescentius at once re-established the Republic and deposed Gregory in 997. Gregory excommunicated him, but Crescentius laughed and arranged the election of John XVI as pope. Otto returned, deposed John, gouged out his eyes, cut off his tongue and nose, and paraded him through the streets of Rome on an ass with his face to the tail. Crescentius and 12 Republican leaders were beheaded, and their bodies were hung from the battlements of St. Angelo in 998. Gregory resumed the papacy and died, probably of poison, in 999. Otto replaced him with one of the most brilliant of all the popes. Gerbert was born of lowly parentage near Aurillac in Auvergne, circa 940, and at an early age entered a monastery there. At the abbot's suggestion, he went to Spain to study mathematics, and in 970 Count Borel of Barcelona took him to Rome. Pope John XIII was impressed by the monk's learning and recommended him to Otto I. For a year Gerbert taught in Italy, and at that time or later had Otto II among his pupils. Then he went to Reims to study logic in the cathedral school, and presently we find him head of the school from 972 to 982. He taught an unusual variety of subjects, including the classic poets. He wrote an excellent Latin, and letters sometimes rivaling those of Sidonius. Wherever he went, he collected books and spent his funds recklessly to have copies made of manuscripts in other libraries. Perhaps we owe to him the preservation of Cicero's orations. He led the Christian world in mathematics, introduced an early form of the Arabic numerals, wrote on the abacus and the astrolabe, and composed a treatise on geometry. He invented a mechanical clock and an organ operated by steam. So many were his scientific accomplishments that after his death he was reputed to have possessed magical powers. When Adalbero died in 988, Gerbert sought to succeed him as Archbishop of Reims. But Hugh Capet appointed instead Arnulf, a bastard son of the dying Carolingian house. Arnulf plotted against Hugh, an ecclesiastical council deposed him despite papal protests, and chose Gerbert archbishop in 991. 4 years later, a papal legate persuaded a synod at Moisson to unseat Gerbert. The humiliated scholar went to the court of Otto III in Germany, received every honor there, and molded the mind of the young king to the idea of restoring a Roman Empire with its capital at Rome. Otto made him Archbishop of Ravenna, and in 999 Pope. Gerbert took the name of Sylvester II, as if to say that he would be a second Sylvester to a second world-unifying Constantine. Had he and Otto lived another decade, they might have realized their dream, for Otto was the son of a Byzantine princess, and Gerbert might have become a philosopher king. But in the 4th year of his papacy, Gerbert died, poisoned, said Roman rumor, by the same Stephania who had poisoned Otto. Their aspirations and the busy politics of the world around them show how few were the Christians who took seriously the notion that the world would end in the year 1000. At the beginning of the 10th century, a church council had announced that the final century of history had begun. At its close, a small minority of men so believed, and prepared themselves for the Last Judgment. The great majority went on their unwanted ways, working, playing, sinning, praying, and trying to outlive senility. There is no evidence of any panic of fear in the year 1000, nor even of any rise in gifts to the Church. After the death of Gerbert, the decay of the papacy was resumed. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.